Hi.
Hi, Professor.
Hey. So this is being recorded, and when we're finished, I'll send you the link to the recording. Okay, so let's talk about your paper, and let's go to it here. And so I click here, and here's your paper. So you write, American society suffered great chaos in the 1960s. In 1963, a law that guarantees the right to vote for Black people passed the parliament, reversing the racial order that came down for hundreds of years. However, Black people's poor economic status is not improved only by legal equality. Blacks were angry at the contradiction of legal equality and economic differences. In 1967, they caused a nationwide Black uprising. White people in the South turned their backs on the ruling Democratic. White people in the South turned their backs on the ruling Democratic Party, which allowed Black people to improve their status and later become loyal supporters of the Republican Party. Yeah, and Democrats enjoyed their status for 40 years until the 1970s, thanks to overwhelming support from white people in the South. Democrats enjoyed their status for 40 years until the late 1970s, thanks to overwhelming support from white people in the South. So you mean what, that the Democrats? Oh. Well, I mean, actually, the Democrats had dominated the South since the end of the Civil War, right? I mean, that since the Republican Party was associated with the North and the victory of the North against the South, and the Republican Party was represented, by Abraham Lincoln. The South used to be called the Solid South. It was always supporting the Democratic Party for almost 100 years after the Civil War was over. And now it's still, in a sense, a solid South insofar as, for example, it's become, since the 1960s, it's shifted to Republican Party to become solidly Republican. So the South is now, 50 years after the civil rights legislation, has now become almost solidly Republican, and it's become the heartland or the base of the Republican Party. And that's beginning to change. Well, there are indications that it's changing. For example, Georgia surprisingly elected 2 Democratic senators in the November 2020 elections by very close margins to 2 Democratic senators. And Georgia voted for Joe Biden by something like 17,000 votes. Joe Biden won the state of Georgia, the Democrat. And that's the first time that's happened since Jimmy Carter ran for president, who was from Georgia, right? And he was the former governor of Georgia. And then he won in 1976. And I don't think he won in 1980. I'd have to check. But so maybe the South is changing, and it's changing partly because of the increasing globalization of Georgia, particularly the big city of Atlanta. Atlanta, of course, was one of the only big cities in the American South, right? I mean, in terms of what caused what led to the Civil War, and then what led to the dominance of the Democratic Party in the South after the Civil War. One of the factors was that only Atlanta was really a big city, and maybe New Orleans. New Orleans and Atlanta were 2 big cities in the South, and then Atlanta began to develop and is now a major headquarters for a number of international corporations, including most famously perhaps is Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola is headquartered in Atlanta, and Delta Airlines, they have the whole Terminal 2 here at the Incheon Airport. They're headquartered in Atlanta, and CNN is headquartered in Atlanta. So that city has become a global headquarters. And with that has moved a lot of people from international backgrounds have moved there. And also many people that have have higher degrees of college education have moved there to work for these corporations. And also it's become a place where Black people, it's become sort of the capital of the capital of Black America. If you want to identify a city that is in a sense the place where Black political power is strongest, you probably have to point to, I would point to Atlanta, Georgia. And so a lot of Black people have moved back to Georgia and back to Atlanta because they feel comfortable there. They feel more comfortable there. So there's a New York Times journalist, editorial writer, Charles Blow, who's a Black writer for the New York Times, the most prominent newspaper, national newspaper in the United States, that is the leader in news coverage. He publicly announced he was moving back to Atlanta because he feels he wants to be, he's Black, he's African American, he wants to be among other African American people. And so, and so but I guess I want to make sure we correct this. Enjoyed their, and so Democrats enjoyed their status for at least 80 years, well, 100 years, let's put 100 years, until thanks to overwhelming support from white people in the South. That began to change. The Democratic Party began to lose votes in the South when Harry Truman, who was president of the United States, pushed through the US Congress the first attempt to come up with civil rights legislation in, I think it was 1848. He tried to pass minor civil rights legislation to begin to end segregation and particularly attacks against Black people in the American South. And when that legislation was passed, we already began to see certain states in the southern area of the Confederacy, the parts of the United States that tried to break away during the Civil War, started to vote against their Democratic Party one state at a time. And then that increased with as the Democratic Party moved more strongly towards civil rights legislation in the 1950s and particularly in the 1960s. And there's been a lot of work, some work in academic work in terms of why did we see the United States move towards implementing this national federal laws to intervene in these southern states to require that they stop segregating and marginalizing their populations, where up to 1/3 or more of the population is Black, is African American in these states. And I've seen some research that shows that one important reason was the Cold War, that the United States was locked in this conflict with the Soviet Union for influence around the world. And and Lyndon Johnson became president after John F. Kennedy was killed. And he won election, his own election in 1964 as president, after he had served for a year as president after Kennedy was murdered. He ran for president in 1964. And then in 1965, right after he became president, he sent large numbers of American troops to fight the communist forces in Vietnam. And so he was really escalating this global competition with the Soviet Union for influence around the world, which John Kennedy had not focused so much on that. John Kennedy was an interesting president, that he viewed the world in more complex terms, I think, than Lyndon Johnson. He actually saw nationalism at work in these different countries. But Kennedy was murdered, and then Lyndon Johnson believed that the Soviet Union and China were instigating these rebellions in the former colonies of Europe, in Asia and Africa. And the Soviet Union and the United States were engaged in open competition for influence, of course, by claiming that their system was the best system. The best system for the world is the American system. The countries that are coming out of European colonialism, like the former British and French and Portuguese and colonies, that they should adopt an American model or American Western model, versus the Soviet Union, which is claiming, of course, that they provide a better model for these countries to develop, these newly independent countries to develop and rapidly. And of course the justification for these European empires, when they were created beginning in the 16th century and through into the end of these empires in the 20th century, their justification often included racism, right? That these Black people and these Asian people are backward barbarians or children, and they should be civilized by the British or the French or the whomever's controlling them, and that these Black people are inferior, that their culture, if not their biology, certainly their culture is inferior and backwards. So there was a disadvantage for the Western world to claim that these former colonies that had been former colonies of the Western countries, of France and Britain, they should follow a Western model of development. And so there was a strong concern that became even stronger when Kennedy was killed and Lyndon Johnson became president, that these former European colonies, that they would reject Western models because the West had dominated them in the name of imperial racism for many years and exploited them. Their experience with capitalism was very, very brutal, was very vicious. It was very exploitative to make as much money for French companies or British companies or whomever. And so the Americans were trying to convince these peoples that they were not like the British and the French former imperial masters, and that the United States was a different kind of country. But the Soviet Union was claiming throughout its time, since it was formed from the 1920s until well into the 20th century, that America is inherently racist, that America is inherently a racist country, that America hangs and murders its Black people in lynchings, and that's the nature of the Western model. That Western capitalism, as represented particularly by the United States, is the most rich and powerful Western country. It's inherently racist, and so there was a strong incentive for the Americans to rectify segregation and Jim Crow in the American South as part of this competition for global influence with the Soviet Union, whom the Americans were concerned, that they had a really attractive model for the former imperial colonies of Western Europe. They were claiming, of course, that the Russians had always claimed that they had been a de facto colony of the West under the Tsar until the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. They were a semi-colony, and look what they have done under communism. Look how rapidly they developed. They went from a relatively backward country, at least by European standards, in 1920, to becoming a superpower in the space of a few decades, after being destroyed by the Germans in World War II and invaded and defeating the Germans. So this model was seen as very attractive, and this was seen as attractive, for example, to other weaker countries like China. China, the Communist Party won the civil war there in 1949, and so there was, I mean that needs to be emphasized, because that's one of the factors that has to be introduced to explain why Donald Trump emerged. That from the American perspective, globalization and all of the diversification that comes with the globalization, by opening up your country to trade and encouraging cooperation with the rest of the world, and including tourism and visits and labor migration, and encouraging, like, for example, foreign college students to come study in the United States at American universities, and often they would stay, right? A lot of them would come to the United States and would stay. They would want to get a job in the United States and make a lot of money in the United States. This was very much connected. America's globalization was very much connected with the Cold War and the supposed competition with the Soviet Union and communism. And this was a shared. There was a shared view among American leaders that until the Vietnam War, that the Soviet Union was a dangerous threat, and I just want to find my questions that I wrote, my comments that I wrote in your paper, because I pasted those comments here. So let me find out remind myself what I wrote in the comments of your paper. Okay, there it is. So, yeah, that there was a shared view that this was a price that the Americans had to pay. Of course, they got lots of benefits too, right? I mean, spreading American influence, American culture. I mean, look at us. We're having this class in English, right? At an American-style university. I mean, there were a lot of benefits for some elements of the American society to globalization, motivated by competition with the Soviet Union. But and Americans generally were convinced about this communist threat through the Korean War. I mean, you don't hear much protest against the Korean War. I don't recall reading much that there was much protest by Americans against the Korean War when the Korean War was going on. But then there was protest during the Vietnam War, and the Vietnam War, for reasons that we talked about in class, America had changed in terms of its awareness of what was going on in the world, in terms of the nature of American society. But the Vietnam War turned out to be a disaster in the sense that it was a war that America lost. And there was a significant section of American society turned against this containment focus of the United States to contain the Soviet Union as necessary for America's well-being. But it never became the only or the dominant view in the United States. Jimmy Carter was elected president in 1976, and he declared that he was not going to focus upon containment as the focus of American foreign policy, because containment supposedly, contributed to this disaster in Vietnam. So he's going to focus on human rights, but this focus on human rights, according to Carter's enemies and adversaries, political opponents, caused the United States to fail to stop the Soviet Union when supposedly the Soviet Union and its allies expanded their influence into Africa and particularly into Latin America in the late 1970s during the Carter administration. So Carter becomes president in January 1975, and the Somoza family corrupt dictatorship in Nicaragua is overthrown by the Sandinistas and Daniel Ortega, who's, by the way, president of Nicaragua today. And they're talking in Marxist communist terms, the Sandinistas, and they're getting help from the Soviet Union and also Cuba, and then also there's a socialist revolution in Grenada off the coast of Venezuela, in the Caribbean, and then of course before Carter comes into power, the different in guerrilla organizations fighting against the Portuguese to control these former Portuguese colonies, Angola and Mozambique. They come to power in Angola and Mozambique, and they're also talking in Marxist communist terms for reasons we talked about earlier. Remember, their experience with capitalism was not very nice, was very unpleasant. And also communist forces come to power, or actors come to power in places like Ethiopia and Somalia who are also talking in communist terms. And those adversaries of Jimmy Carter in the United States, they claim that this is Carter's fault. That because Carter was a fool, Jimmy Carter was a fool, and let down America's guard against communism due to the disaster of Vietnam that another Democrat, Lyndon Johnson, had created, that Carter is to blame for this. And then, of course, there was also increasing economic difficulties in the United States because with the rise of Arab nationalism, and the increase in spread of Arab nationalism, there's another war in the Middle East against Israel, and the Arab regimes for a time cooperate to raise the price of oil and take control of their oil industries from the outside Western oil corporations and take them for themselves, and also raise the price of oil and dramatically, and also to try to show their solidarity with the Palestinians. And this causes inflation in the United States, together with the money that U.S. was spending to fight the war in Vietnam. That was a lot of that was borrowed money. And after losing the Vietnam War, and the communists winning in Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos under Ford, and then the communists coming to power in Mozambique and Libya, in Angola, and then Nick Carter coming into office, and then communism continuing to spread further, also producing this. There was also uprising against America's ally in the Persian Gulf, the Shah of Iran, that the United States had put in power through a CIA coup in 1953, and then the Shah, when he resigned and fled the country, he went to the United States because he wanted medical treatment. He had cancer and he would soon die. But when he went to the United States, the revolutionaries in Iran seized control of the U.S. embassy in Tehran, and they claimed or believed that the United States was preparing to try to use the CIA again to put the Shah back in power. And so they seized the American embassy personnel, and they held on to the American embassy personnel for 444 days. And Jimmy Carter appeared to be unable to get those people out. And it was, again, just a continual humiliation, national humiliation that the United States was experiencing. And then, of course, with the overthrow of the Shah and the revolution in Iran, and then the outbreak of the Iran-Iraq war when Saddam Hussein attacked Iran, again, there was a second oil shock, so yet more inflation emerged. And this all, after the loss of the Vietnam War, the resignation of Richard Nixon, and the pardoning of him by Gerald Ford, in the election of Carter and his supposed failures or blame by his opponents as being a failed president. All of this contributed to this upsurge of nationalism that began before Carter, that was, I think, began with the Vietnam War. As the Americans came to realize that this war was a mistake, they still didn't want to admit that they lost, that they were killing and dying and killing people because of they were on the wrong side. So they wanted to demonstrate to themselves that they were still the dominant actor by winning that war at any cost. And of course, they couldn't win the war, just like they couldn't win in Afghanistan later. And but Jimmy Carter was blamed for making the problem worse. And then Ronald Reagan exploits all of these frustrations to exploit the situation to defeat Jimmy Carter in November 1980 elections to become elected president of the United States. And then he's inaugurated as president in January 1981, and the Iranian hostages are released the day he's inaugurated. The hostages that Iran is holding, the embassy personnel, are released the day Ronald Reagan is inaugurated. And then, of course, Ronald Reagan declares that Carter was wrong. The main focus of the source of evil in the world is the Soviet Union. Ronald Reagan he explicitly said that in a speech. I can find it on YouTube. He made that statement. And there were some dangerous moments. The United States invaded Grenada. The United States supported the counter-revolutionaries in fighting the Sandinista regime in a brutal civil war that killed thousands of Nicaraguans. And then Mikhail Gorbachev comes to power in the Soviet Union and begins a détente strategy with the United States, appearing to confirm that because Ronald Reagan had the will and determination to resist the Soviet Union, that thanks to his will and determination to compensate for the stupidity of Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan set the stage for winning the Cold War. Ronald Reagan stays in office until January 1989, and he's succeeded by his vice president, George H.W. Bush, who was inaugurated as president on January 1989. And then by November 1989, all the communist regimes in Eastern Europe had disappeared. And then in 2 years later, in the Soviet Union would disappear. And George H.W. Bush is the president at the time, but Ronald Reagan, as you might remember in the midterm paper, Daniel Flynn views Ronald Reagan as one of the greatest presidents of the United States, with Abraham Lincoln and George Washington. And it's because those people that are like Daniel Flynn in that midterm paper you wrote, they view Ronald Reagan as the reason why we won the Cold War, that America won, that supposedly he won the Cold War for the United States, despite Jimmy Carter, not to mention Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky and the feminist social movements and the LGBTQ social movements and all of those leftist degenerates undermining America's will and determination to do what was necessary to win the Cold War, despite the mistake of Vietnam being committed by a Democrat, Lyndon Johnson. And Richard Nixon had to sacrifice himself to do what was necessary to win the Cold War in this Daniel Flynn type worldview. Richard Nixon was the one who opened up relations with China to pressure the Soviet Union by using good relations with China against their Chinese adversary, to pressure the Soviet Union to make pressure on Vietnam that supposedly helped break up the communist world, that caused this communist world to break up. You know, that's the Cold Warrior worldview. That still, even though the Vietnam War was a mistake, that the Cold War eventually ended because Republicans had the will and determination to do what was necessary to cause the communist world to fragment and break up. And it was Richard Nixon who brought the communist China into the American side to turn it against the Soviet Union and help eventually set the stage for winning the Cold War, in spite of the resistance he faced from hippies and leftists and radicals and Howard Zinn type people in the United States and their supporters. And George, but the point is that most of the Americans by 1991, when the Soviet Union broke up, most Americans had been brought back into the belief, maybe because they wanted to be brought back or because Ronald Reagan made them feel good. Most Americans, not all, but they had bought back into this notion that the Soviet Union was a Russian version of Nazi Germany. And they were willing to tolerate the cost of globalization to deal with this. And then the Soviet Union disappeared. Poof. And George H.W. Bush, declares a new world order. We will now build a new world order, and declares that the United States will not allow Saddam Hussein to unify the Arabs under his dictatorship, to rectify the legacies of British and French colonialism in the Middle East. He will not allow that, and he declares war. And asked for the Congress to authorize use of force against Iraq. And for the brief time from 1990 into spring 1991, when the war was launched and was over by May 1991, George H.W. Bush was incredibly popular according to public opinion surveys. But then he lost the election to Bill Clinton in November 1992. And he lost in part for a number of reasons, but also because Americans thought that there was not enough focus on American domestic needs. That George H.W. Bush was a globalist focused upon doing what was necessary and paying the costs of America, paying the cost of what was necessary. This is not the only reason why he lost, but one of the reasons that George H.W. Bush was too focused on globalization and globalism and not enough on benefiting the non-globalized part of America. and the economy was weak, and Bill Clinton exploited that to also because George H.W. Bush tried to take on the Israel lobby briefly at the end of the war, and he got punished for that. I mean, the Israel lobby was pushing for the United States to attack Iraq, and they did. But then George H.W. Bush, he tried to make Israel stop building illegal settlements in the occupied territories by freezing American aid to Israel after the war with Iraq. He thought he could do that and use his authority to finally end the conflict between the Arabs and the Israelis, and that would require that Israel create a Palestinian state. And that meant stop building on the occupied territories. And Bill Clinton was willing to play with the Israel lobby for that benefit, for his own political benefit. And he also criticized George H.W. Bush as not being sufficiently strong against the Serbs in Yugoslavia, as Yugoslavia was breaking up in a violent war. And in other words, and Serbia was typically seen as allied with Russia, and Russia was still seen as an enemy or a problem. So the point is that a lot of people came to believe that basically the whole establishment of the United States, the political establishment of the United States, a lot of Americans came to believe that supported Donald Trump, that establishment somehow is mostly focused upon the well-being of the rest of the world, not enough focused on the well-being of Americans. That they're willing to spend too many American resources to do what they want to do in the rest of the world, rather than do what they need to do, what needs to be done to protect the well-being of Americans. And along with this belief that basically the new left social movements were part of this globalization commitment, as part of a global human rights commitment that America has to be like the rest of the world in terms of social welfare, justice, human rights protections. And that this was exploited by Donald Trump and his supporters to do enough to win the election in 2016, with the claim that that Hillary Clinton and the establishment figures in the United States were too focused on the well-being of the rest of the world. But we're out of time now, and I have to go to another student. Do you have any questions?
No.
Okay, that's it then. Okay, and I'll send you any changes. I don't think I made any changes to your paper, so, or I made that one change, so I'll send it to you. Okay, bye.